Now we will explore the science of Nyaya. Is Nyaya old or new compared to the Upanishads? How old is Nyaya as a system? And what does it mean when we say the word Nyaya? What is the scope of Nyaya? It is quite possible that the earliest forms of Nyaya germinated from debates, discussions, and dialectics amongst people who were trying to interpret the Vedas and the Upanishads. So it is possible that Nyaya started as a method of reasoning and debate used in Vedic schools. Now, what is meant by this word? The word is derived from the root ni, which relates to notions like leading or method. It can mean a rule, principle, method, a logical argument, or a syllogistic pattern. Originally, it might have referred to any logical pattern of reasoning, not necessarily the full philosophical system, but over time it came to denote the whole philosophical school, especially focusing on logic, debate, epistemology. Originally, Nyaya would uh, have referred to the art of reasoning about Vedic sentences, and later it might have become an independent philosophical system. Now we come to Nyaya as a science. Now, Nyaya considers itself a science of valid knowledge or Pramana Shastra. It deals with quite a few things, for example, sources of knowledge. It has certain ideas about which knowledge coming from which types are deemed to be true knowledge, perception, inference, comparison, testimony. There are some objects of knowledge like self, body, and God. And it also deals with debating techniques like how to argue the logical fallacies, refuting opponents. So, Nyaya is often described as a tool which illuminates the different sciences. So, Nyaya describes what is the right means of what the right means of knowing is, so that the other disciplines can proceed correctly. Now, later in the tradition, the logical side was more emphasized on, but doesn't mean Nyaya is only centered around logic, because earlier it had a full metaphysical system which was very close to Vaisheshika. Now, what is the date of the Nyaya Sutra? So, some modern scholars, they are of the view that the Nyaya Sutra has additions or interpolations, wherein one layer argues against Buddhists, other layer addresses other Hindu schools. So this makes a difficult job to ascertain the date. What are the arguments for a later date? That is, arguments that Nyaya is post-Buddhist in nature. So these arguments are as follows. First, the text Nyaya Sutra knows certain Buddhist doctrines and it also refutes them. The text seems to react to the developed Buddhist logic and epistemology, and there are also references in the Buddhist works which suggest that the Buddhist logicians came before some very well-known Nyaya logicians. But these arguments are not unchallenged. There are counter arguments to these. For example, the earlier Brahmanical texts, like certain Dharma Shastras, they already show some kind of reasoning which is very similar to Nyaya. For example, the kinds of debates, the debates they have, the kind of tools they employ, for example, pratigya, thesis, hetu, which is reason, which we'll see later, drishtan, example, these might be actually before the highly systematized Buddhist logic came. So, in conclusion, we might say that it started early as a general method of reasoning, and the text, which is Nyaya Sutra, possessed, it might have been edited and it would have expanded over a long period, and it incorporates arguments against Buddhists and others. So there is no strong reason to think that Nyaya's beginnings were late, uh, and the traditions would already have existed quite early. It would also help to see some of the views of um, some eminent people. For example, uh, uh, Dr. S.C. Vidyabhushan. He believed that the earlier part of Nyaya was written by Gautam around 550 BCE, but the Nyaya Sutras of Akshapada, which is the canonical form we have, they were written around 150 CE. So now S.C. Vidyabhushan, he argues that the Nyaya Sutra was written under the influence of Aristotle, but it is a very speculative assumption because we don't have any credible claim demonstrating that Akshapada actually knew Aristotle. And there are some counter arguments to the theory which we summarized earlier. For example, Goldstucker, he argued that Patanjali and Katyayana, which were as far as 140 BC and 4th BC, they knew Nyaya teachings as well. The evidence which we have are as follows. For example, Patanjali Mahabhashya shows awareness of Nyaya style reasoning, and Kautilya also knew something like Nyaya, and he calls it Anvikshiki, which is the science of inquiry. So we can safely say Nyaya as a discipline existed at least by the 4th century BCE, and Nyaya, some of the Nyaya sutras might have reached a very, uh, final form around 2nd century CE and so on. So this is about when can we date Nyaya to, and what is the relation to Vaisheshik then? So Vaisheshik has a antiquity. Uh, for example, we'll see many evidences. We will see this Charak and the Lankavatar Sutra as evidence. Now, these all point to the fact that Vaisheshik is very old. For example, Charak, who was as we know, he was a great medical author, he quotes a Vaisheshik Sutra, and his whole structure of medical physics bases on Vaisheshika doctrines like atoms, gunas, or categories. So, if Charak is around 80 CE, Vaisheshika Sutra might be older than that, must be. And then Lankavatar Sutra, which is a Buddhist text quoted by Ashwaghosh. Thus, it is also earlier than 80 CE. That sutra also mentions atomic doctrine. It so it seems to suggest that atomic theory was already well established by then. It was likely derived from Vaisheshik. So it is very safe to call Vaisheshik Sutras pre-Buddhist or very early. Another question which seems to strike us is that does Vaisheshik represent an old Mimamsa? Now the tradition strongly links Nyaya and Vaisheshik together. But could it be possible that Vaisheshik represents an old school of Mimamsa which is different from Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra? Now, at first sight, it seems quite impossible, but a careful reading of Vaisheshika Sutras leads us to carefully examine this. The reason being that Charak Samhita quotes verses on gunas, and these verses strongly draw from Vaisheshika handbooks like Bhasha Pariched. Charak's description and enumeration of gunas begins with para, which is universality. They end with prayatn, effort, and it includes buddhi as a quality. But in the extant Vaisheshika Sutra, you find a list of 6 gunas, which are gurutva, dravyatva, sneha, samskar, dharma, and adharma. In another part of the sutra, there is even a longer enumeration which starts with para, ends with prayatna,
And in that very list, Buddhi is included among these. But in Charaka's list, Buddhi is separately enumerated. From this mismatch, we can conclude that Charak's text might have been written at a time where Vaisheshika included only the six gunas as guna, but the later additions in Vaisheshika philosophy would have extended the list. What I mean to say is that Charaka's version, they reflect an earlier stage of Vaisheshik development where doctrines were still being formed and systematized. Bhashya Pariched is a very later text, and it is a compilation from old Karikas as mentioned by Vishwanath, which shows that by Charak's time there were already compendiums gathering Vaisheshika ideas which were currently in flux. Further evidence of the Vaisheshika antiquity is spurred by this fact that Vaisheshika Sutras show no awareness of the doctrines of Buddhism. When they discuss the existence of the soul, they never mention the Buddhist thesis of Anatman, which is no soul. They do not argue against Buddhist positions in a very explicit manner. So they suggest they were composed before Buddhism became a dominant rival. They also show no reference explicitly to Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra. There is no clear allusion there reacting to Mimamsa's theories. So we shouldn't think of Vaisheshika as a commentary or an offshoot of Mimamsa in that form, in its extant form. Another argument is that the way inference or anuman as a means of getting valid knowledge is handled in Vaisheshika, that way does not use the developed Nyaya terminology of Purvavat and Sheshvat, which we'll see. These are the two technical Nyayic inferences. Now, this suggests that the fully developed Nyaya inference theory was not yet existing when the Vaisheshika Sutras were composed. At the last, we have Upanishadic evidence in the form of Svetashvara Upanishad, which speaks of time as the ultimate cause of things. Vaisheshika Sutra also in various places treat time or kal as the ultimate cause. But the Upanishad nowhere uses the technical Nyaya vocabulary for inference. So we come to the conclusion that Vetashvara and Vaisheshika share ideas like time and they regard it as the ultimate cause. But since Nyaya's inferential terminology is absent, this all supports the assertion that Vaisheshika is very old and perhaps it is the oldest of all the darshanas we still possess. So, uh, so does Vaisheshika represent an old Mimamsa? Vaisheshika opens with dharma. So, see the first sutra of Vaisheshika says that the object of this treatise is to explain dharma, and it defines dharma as what gives prosperity, abhyudaya, and ultimate good, which is nishreyas. And it declares that we should regard Veda as valid because Veda can dictate the dharma and we depend on the Veda to ascertain that what actions are included as dharma. This is also how Jaimini's Mimamsa Sutra start. Jaimini also begins with the inquiry into dharma and defines dharma as relation to in relation to the Vedic injunction. From this, Vaisheshika is close to Mimamsa in spirit. It is not the case that either are abstract physics for its own sake, but these are systems that want to clarify dharma and what the effects of dharma are. Now, why talk of Padartha categories at all? So Vaisheshika Sutra, after stating its goal as explanation of dharma, moves on to elaborate on padartha, which are the categories like substance, action, quality, particularity, generality, inherence, and adṛṣṭa. What has the list of categories to do with dharma? Isn't it irrelevant now? The Veda prescribes certain acts, certain karma like sacrifices, which are supposed to produce results. Results like heaven, prosperity, liberation, and the mechanism linking these ritual acts to the results is not very clear in ordinary experience. Vaisheshika wants to show that many of the many of the things we see in natural world are not explainable by ordinary physical causes, but they can be explained if we assume an unseen force, adṛṣṭa, produced by dharma. So the description of padarth, it's not the case that it's something very uh, grandiose or free floating. It is a way of proving that there must be adṛṣṭa forming by Vedic actions. Otherwise, many phenomena are inexplicable.